Wow, that was such a kind introduction and generous introduction, Peter. I want to thank Peter Lurie for inviting me to come and share actually mostly new work with you today. I want to thank Abigail Cheever as well for participating in this couple of days here. I should start by, I also want to thank all of you for coming. It's late in the day. I'm going to try and keep things interesting. I've got a number of images. I've got several clips I want to show. What I'm trying to do in this talk is actually connect a couple of these recent projects. This book on really global international film noir that I co-wrote with my friend and former colleague, Jennifer Fay, and my book on David Lynch. You would think that I would have something to say about David Lynch in the film noir book, but that's not true. And you would think that I would have something to say about film noir in the David Lynch book, and that's not true. In fact, I rarely in the Lynch book mention his engagement with the genre of noir, if indeed it is a genre at all. And so the talk today is really, for me, an attempt to think Lynch and noir through each other. And I'm coming at that through the very sexy topic of infrastructure. And I'll say a little bit more about why I do that. So, the noir infrastructure, a Lynchian heir. Early in David Lynch's astonishing first feature, Eraserhead, the film's anxious protagonist, Henry Spencer, enters the lobby of his apartment building, steps into its expectant elevator, and presses the button to ascend. He waits, seemingly forever, for the thing's doors to close. It's a bad interface. The delay between button pressing and door closing suggests faulty wiring, some glitch in the building's electrical system. We listen to the slow whine of the elevator as it rises before Lynch confirms the malfunction, cutting to Henry inside the elevator, whose interior lights now flicker on and off as the decrepit box slowly rises. Henry looks anxious. And why not? We're anxious for him, perhaps even paranoid about Henry's subjection to a barely sensed network of power. We've been primed to doubt the security of the building's infrastructure. Henry has only arrived home after trekking through an alienating environment of industrial decay. Mounds of earth, the trace of some invisible development, a tangle of pipes and hoses overgrown with weeds, stagnant pools of foreboding liquid reflecting the shadows of a factory whose lights somehow are still on. Just as Henry's lobby, from hindsight, is recognizable as the first iconically Lynchian room, so too is the elevator gag, the first in a series of infrastructural failures in Lynch's work, interruptions in the power circuits or surges of energy of the kind that will, in Eraserhead, be sparked by Henry's final act of infanticide, and will later become an auteurist hallmark of the Lynchian. In Blue Velvet, remember, curious Jeffrey Beaumont, disguised as the Bug Man, infiltrates Dorothy Valen's Deep River apartment and hears the buzz of the flickering electric sign. You can see the elevator sign flickering on and off in this image. This time, the elevator is kaput. When the lighting is on the fritz and you feel uneasy about it, you are in a David Lynch movie. As Michel Chion has observed, Lynch may owe his inaugural elevator gag to the techno-comedy of one of Lynch's favorite directors, the Frenchman Jacques Tati, whose infrastructural imagination insists on the ill fit between human beings and the inhumanity of their built environment. In his 1967 masterpiece, Playtime, which is a comedy about rapid state-sponsored modernization in France, which I'm sure many of you know quite well, Tati explores Monsieur Hulot's subjection to the caprices of elevator doors. Here he's walking through a building in this very cold, inhuman, modern Paris, doesn't realize that he's about to walk into an elevator, and then there he is. And he's surprised and taken upstairs, and then ejected promptly from the elevator into a new adventure. Tati explores Hulot's subjection to the caprices of elevator doors, as well as the push-button unease of post-war French modernization. Much of the film's comedy comes in the way Tati makes modern infrastructure visible in its absurd unworking. The broken air conditioner at the Royal Garden Club. So at the end of the film, this club and the built environment of this club completely collapses. The air conditioner breaks, and Tati sets up this gag where you can actually see this plastic plane melting as the room heats up. And then when the air conditioner kicks back in again, you see the wings of the plane rise again. That unnatural color and hum of a two-green neon sign. So they go and they're hanging out in this cafeteria/pharmacy, and you can hear in this very Lynchian way, although it's also Tati's way, the hum of electricity, and everything looks unnatural and disgusting. The unnatural color and hum of a two-green neon sign, the inefficiency of electrical panels. We get a lot of gags built on this in the film. And the slapstick obstinacy of glass, refusing its modernist duty of transparency and openness. So you see Hulot, the comic, Tati's clown, is there to meet his friend, Monsieur Giffard, and they keep missing each other. And he runs into the glass, smashing his nose in one of the many gags set up in the built environment of the film. Generally, though, the failure of infrastructure does not unfold in the vein of comedy in Lynch's work or, to be fair, in life. Instead, bad infrastructure plays in the moody key of noir, producing anxiety and apprehension, paranoia, even terror. Louis Malle, for example, would build a superb French thriller out of the claustrophobia of a man trapped in a stalled elevator to the gallows, 1957. Alfred Hitchcock, to name a director of more obvious importance to Lynch, begins Sabotage, his 1936 adaptation of Joseph Conrad's novel The Secret Agent, a melodrama about terrorism, by recasting political violence as damage to modern infrastructure. In the 1907 source novel, the anarchists seek to blow up the Greenwich Observatory, the very grid of imperial time itself. Sabotage, by contrast, capitalizes on the newly publicized threat of aerial bombing in the event of a second European war. It opens with a blackout caused by a political enemy of the British state. In the film's first sequence, a Lynchian light bulb flickers before a systemic failure of the London power grid, which Hitchcock cleverly works into a meditation on the power, charge, and explosive energy of his own flickering medium. We cut from the voltage meter of the failed power station to a montage of an anxious public. Londoners abandon stalled tube lines. A frustrated crowd masses outside the darkened Bijou movie theater owned by the film's beleaguered terrorist, Mr. Verloc, and dangerously proximate to the fragile home he shares with his unsuspecting wife, Winnie. The film that the Verloc's customers have been cheated out of seeing by the blackout is, it appears, called The Peril of the Air, an eerie anticipation of the Blitz and London's future of ruined infrastructure. The freelance news photographer, Arthur Felig, better known as Ouija, who would become famous for images of quotidian violence and disaster, and an important figure in the noir sensibility, specialized in similar acts of what he called psychic photography. For those who don't know, Ouija is a crime photographer, famous for his ability to show up immediately upon the scene of any given disaster, shooting, dramatic event in New York. Once, in the heart of Chinatown, he captured the sheer terror of failed infrastructure, photographing a building immediately before and after it exploded when a burst water main caused the gas main to catch fire. And I don't know if you guys can read this. Top image, peaceful scene in the heart of Chinatown. The cops who always patrol the beat in pairs think I'm crazy because I'm taking their picture. Right after I took the photo above, the street blew up. The water main pipes broke. The gas main caught fire, followed by an explosion. 500 tenement dwellers in the block were driven from their homes. This shows up in Ouija's collection of photographs entitled Naked City. Conrad's imperiled observatory, Hitch's filmic blackout, Ouija's combustible gas main, all are examples of what I'll call today noir infrastructure. The term defines industrial and post-industrial modernity as a horizon of risk and contingency, of insecurity and human vulnerability to the systemic or catastrophic failures of the built environment, its myriad ways of going bad. But in its adjectival form here, noir also refers to an unstable way of feeling about material instability, about infrastructural malaise. For film noir, what James Nairmore has influentially described as a critical invention rather than a stable genre, has never convincingly named anything certain in structure, a genre, say, or a cycle. Instead, it has drifted towards the immaterial and effective in lived experience, working as an umbrella term for more diffuse or uneasy moods or tones. Noir, we might say, has always been atmospheric, and David Lynch understands this better than many directors. bringing into the foreground infrastructure's way of fading into the background until it goes wrong. The anxious affects so key to Lynch's sensibility, from the power surges of the glitchy elevator in Eraserhead to the global electrical grid of his most recent film, Inland Empire, the film I know many of you were subjected to recently in Professor Keever's 220 class, which I'll talk about at the end of the talk, tend to emerge from what is least stable in our built environment, or what is thrown into visibility or audibility when infrastructure fails and characters find themselves subjected to modes of power only vaguely sensed. No tired exercise in style or parody, Lynch's noir atmospherics train us to apprehend the very material environments of modern apprehension. Lynch attunes us, we might say, to the airy conditions of modern life, what Anthony Giddens calls modernity's disembedding of social relations, their abstraction from the local context of a restricted time and space, their dematerialization and liquefaction, their ways of vanishing into air. Noir infrastructure materializes anxieties also about what is public, common, and thus perhaps taken for granted in modern environments structured by largely abstract, often invisible systems. In this way, Lynch's environments are thus social and shared in surprising ways. They remind us of noir's foundational concern with the forms of urban modernity the genre simultaneously feels anxious about and aestheticizes. They exacerbate noir's ways of making us feel unsettled as these infrastructures are traumatically destroyed or revealed to be fragile or precarious or understood as operating beyond our power or even beyond our capacity to sense them. Noir is, and has always been, concerned about the vulnerable boundaries of interiority itself within these environments, whose energies and power sources, in Lynch's noirs in particular, are only minimally registered by the senses as disturbances in atmosphere, an atmosphere that has become subnatural, infrasensible. Something is happening. When thought through a Lynchian infrastructure, noir interiority seems less a way of propping up an anxious and generally masculine privacy, and this is often the way noir psychology has been described by critics, than a form of insisting on the interior's often invisible but no less systemic linkages to publics, to collectives, or to the networks of social life that belie the autonomy of any given inner experience. This, I suggest, is what it means to breathe Lynchian air. We can safely assume that Raymond Chandler, writing in his 1944 Atlantic monthly essay, The Simple Art of Murder, did not have Ouija's kind of infrastructural dysfunction in mind when he famously observed, "Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid." In a fashion typical of noir's more romantic strains, Chandler is Saturnin about capitalist modernity's decaying public world. And he turns to the interior, the fragile domain of private life, as a respite against the kind of obscenity represented in The Big Sleep, for example, by Carmen Sternwood's so-called nastiness. And for those of you who know this novel, that is the only way in which the obscenity that Carmen represents is referred, nasty, nasty. And yet, tellingly, Marlowe's concluding confrontation with Carmen is staged in the mise-en-scène of outmoded energy infrastructure, decrepit oil derricks. Quote, "The wells were no longer pumping. There was a pile of rusted pipe, a loading platform that sagged at one end, half a dozen empty oil drums lying in a ragged pile. There was the stagnant, oil-scummed water of an old sump, iridescent in the sunlight." That's Chandler. Only Chandler. Even amid this scene of noir modernity, as energies vary depletion or exhaustion, Marlowe is ever resourceful with language. He quips, "Are they going to make a park of all this?" Stagnant and stinking, devoid of energy that the sunlight, by aestheticizing the sludge, perversely returns to it, the oil-scummed water figures the decline of the public sphere by rapacious private enterprise. There will be no park. The smell of infrastructure, as Bruce Robbins has put it, and the fallen cities of Chandler's Los Angeles, and indeed Lynch's Philadelphia in Eraserhead, seem to confirm, is the smell of the public, corroding, rusty, rotten. The private market's unsexy, often unseen handmaiden, infrastructure everywhere makes possible the production, distribution, and aggressive display of commodities for which capitalism will manufacture desire. but infrastructure nonetheless remains neglected, unloved, the invisible object of no one's desire, because in theory, and this is Robbins, it belongs to the public domain, all other tokens of belonging effaced, owned in effect by no one. Like a number of critics who have recently argued for the need to make infrastructure visible and not just, as is most common, seen in its moment of spectacular collapse, decay, or malfunction, Robbins reminds us that infrastructure is a political object. It is the material instantiation of the promise of modernity's built environment as it develops unevenly across the globe, occupying an ambiguous relationship between public works as sites of the welfare state's claims on the common good and the interests of private capital. Embedded then in the problem of infrastructure, access to clean water, efficient sewers, trains that run on time, are questions, of course, about power and resources, about what is shared or common in public life, about the political horizons in which access to some of modernity's less glittering goods can be taken for granted as conveniences for some, but urgently demanded by others as basic human rights or part of a felt demand for democratic citizenship, about forms of systemic or networked connectivity as basic presuppositions of modern social life, linkages that infrastructure often materially encodes. Like infrastructure generally, then, noir infrastructure is not so much invisible as it is hiding in plain view. Noir enjoys, of course, a privileged relationship to the modernist topos of the bad city, in which decaying infrastructure tropes the turmoil of the masculine unconscious. With its generic roots tangled in the local soil of 1930s hard-boiled fiction, noir is inflected with Depression-era populist concern about the rehabilitation of uncivil society that would dovetail with the more utopian public works programs of New Deal liberalism and its own faith in social security and infrastructure as hedges against risk, speculation, and the basic volatility of markets. As Ed Dimmenberg has argued, noir itself also mediated a series of transformations in the built environment of urban modernity at mid-century. While Dimmenberg's book does not explore noir's metropoetics of infrastructure per se, his terrific account maps the changing spatiality of noir in the context of the infrastructural boom of Eisenhower's post-war autotopia, as well as the dematerialization of infrastructure in the rise of a post-war information society and its centripetal media environments. In our own book on global film noir, Jen Fay and I sought to internationalize Dimmenberg's thesis that American film noir was marked by traces of the non-synchronous in capitalist development. In doing so, we argued that international film noir dramatized the crises of local spaces, not just in the wake of economic and cultural modernization, but also in the face of other global phenomena like economic depression, war, and political occupation. Such phenomena, to put it mildly, do violence to infrastructure, often catastrophically so. And global film noir tracks this in the blocked access to the goods of Mexico City's explosive post-war modernization that defines life in the neo-realist noir slums of Luis Buñuel's Los Olvidados, 1950, for its gang of lost boys, in the attention to homelessness and displacement in a post-war German rubble noir, like Wolfgang Staudt's The Murderers Are Among Us, 1946, in the diseased sumps and rubbled slums of Akira Kurosawa's astonishing crime films Drunken Angel from 1948 and Stray Dog, 1949. And if you don't know any of these films, or some of these films, they're fantastic. I'm not gonna say more about them now, but I'm happy to in the Q&A. In films like these, the ruined infrastructure of brutally destroyed and remade cities stands for the political violence of a post-war world system presided over by the United States and its Cold War conjunction of free worlds and free markets. In all these ways, we might say, the fragility of noir infrastructure is alternatively Freudian or populist, cynical or utopian, and consistently nostalgic. It incarnates the promises and failures of modernity and democracy, but it's built over a deep anxiety about the material structures of public life and their relationship to private interests in both senses of that term, the claims of capital or the compromised security of inner life. For a canonical example of this, let's consider the celebrated opening montage of Jules Dassin's semi-documentary procedural, The Naked City, from 1948.
Well, let's begin our story this way. It's 1 o'clock in the morning on a hot summer night. And this is the face of New York when it's asleep. Or it's nearly asleep as any city ever is. There's something on Wall Street at night. No walls, no beds, no land. A bank is a lonely place at this hour. And even a theater has long been. A question. Will the machines of the factory ever need rest? Does a ship ever feel tired? Or is it only people who are so weary at night? There is a pulse to this thing. And it never stops beating. And some people are in their breath.
It's wonderful working on a newspaper. You meet such interesting people.
You put on a record, you take it off. You put on another. Does anyone listen to this program except my wife? And while some people work, others are rounding off and using up relaxation. And still another is at the close of a life. A hot night has worked its way toward dawn.
We see readily the way the sequence joins urban infrastructure and interiority, here in the style of the modernist city symphony film. Producer Mark Hellinger's voiceover insists on the pulse shared by the city's inhabitants, here a populous cross-section of citizens at work, play, and at the moment of death, and the city as organism. That public body's not quite sleeping face is presented here first devoid of human presence, and later, on some level, indifferent to it, as Dassin suggests in the cruel match cut from the waterworks joining the bathtub tap of the recently murdered Gene Dexter to the quotidian public service of the street cleaning truck. The cut's irony, we might note, is especially sharp, since it recalls Ziga Vertoff's editing strategies in the opening of Man with a Movie Camera, 1929, where the quotidian ablutions of a rising girl are intercut with the public street cleaning of the awakening city. Dassin's plumbing has lost Vertoff's socialist utopianism. Instead, the sequence seeks both to individuate and interiorize citizens, granting access to the tedium, despair, and frustration of these anonymous New Yorkers, and to insist on their substitutability and seriality, there being, as the voiceover has it, an abstract one, some, or still another, arbitrarily selected from a larger statistical totality, 8 million stories in the city. The female janitor, newspaperman, or disc jockey are not personalities so much as positions in urban systems, service networks, infrastructures that exceed them. Part of the self-reflexivity of the montage is to intercut their briefly heard inner lives with the stories of other New Yorkers who we only briefly glimpse now, but will later realize are the protagonists of the film's murder investigation. Well, let's begin our story this way, Hellinger suggests, implying an arbitrary slice into a filigreed network of urban systems that includes, alongside the operations of the street cleaner, the movements of trains and airplanes, the transmissions of a radio broadcast, the circulation of the newspaper, the film's own narrative economy. Like the Naked City's methodical police officers, this feeling of the city's pulse is curiously unfeeling, depersonalized. Public works and public servants are equally abstract mechanisms for processing the functions of urban people. The film's final sequence underscores its commitment to process. It is, of course, a procedural after all. Returning to the montage structure of the opening, Hellinger's voiceover insists wryly that the face, person, and history of Gene Dexter, who we see murdered in this opening clip, whose murder had set in motion the film's plot, was worth, as he puts it, 5 cents a day for 6 days. The sensational details of her case, swiftly commodified and consumed by a public constructed by the newspaper, and now ready for a new case to hit the headlines. Gene Dexter is once again raw matter to be processed by the city's infrastructure in the film's concluding shot as trash. The story of the interior that noir infrastructure rather consistently betrays is, I would suggest, a specifically Enlightenment fantasy of pure air, one that links modernity's dreams of universal progress and development into a more perfect, more equitable future, to modes of communicative clarity and transparency that often assume architectural and infrastructural form in noir. As a space of transmission and visibility, pure air is at once a social fantasy, an architectural fantasy, and a dream of media. In Naked City, the quest for pure air is an epistemological project connected to the film's desire to police New York by making it mappable, to gain a vantage on the systemic totality it represents. For this reason, the film begins from the air, with aerial cinematography of Manhattan under surveillance, and ends in its climactic sequence with panoramic views from the Williamsburg Bridge, from which Gene Dexter's murderer, with nowhere to hide, will plunge to his own death. But this fantasy of the transcendent view, pure air, is in Naked City consistently undercut by Dasson's attention to modernity's inhuman infrastructure, which opens the interiority of its citizens to the abstract systems that connect them. Let's consider another example of noir's movement, a famous one, from the air to the underground. Carol Reed's The Third Man from 1949. From the air, droning on, Orson Welles' war profiteer, Harry Lime, reveals his monstrous indifference to the particularity of human life and suffering below him. Late in the film, Lime is chased into the sewers of occupied Vienna by Holly Martins, played by Joseph Cotten. If infrastructure, as Christopher Otter has argued, is intended to implant and make durable spaces within which if infrastructure is intended to implant and make durable spaces within which the self-control apt for civil behavior becomes possible, then Reed's sewers ironize the failures of such civility in Lime's cheerful barbarism. We know that the film, like Green's source novel, is concerned with structures of interiority because the comical earlier sequence in which the writer, Holly Martin, is whisked to the British Cultural Center to give a lecture on the modern novel, where he's asked what he thinks of James Joyce and whether he, quote, believes in the stream of consciousness. It's a great scene. I hope most of us know it. Martin botches the question, of course, but Reed seems to offer a strangely materialist answer to it in the sound design of the climactic underground encounter between Martins and his alter ego, Harry Lime. As Michael Rubenstein suggests, sound in the sequence is coming from everywhere and nowhere, amplified echoes of German words so distorted with repetition and reverb as to be incomprehensible. In this way, the film, in Rubenstein's reading, gives us the stream of consciousness radically externalized in the sewer. So it takes this high modernist trope, stream of consciousness, and externalizes it in the sewer. No longer a subjective experience of one's own thoughts, but rather the disembodied voices of others impinging upon and blocking the thoughts of Harry Lime as he tries to think through his escape. Not only does urban infrastructure impinge on urban subjectivity in The Third Man, but the sewer's spatial contamination, its transgression of the boundaries between zones of inner life rendered through the sound design, works to explicitly obfuscate the political zones and partisan commitments dividing the occupied city above. In this sense, Lime is at home in the sewer's infrastructure because there he experiences a kind of post-partisan freedom that the film connects to the monstrosity of capital itself. As Alan Hepburn puts it, if the sewers form an unconscious to the city, in that unconscious, capitalism invents itself as an apolitical force. Evident in the animus towards industrial modernity's underground or invisible infrastructure in the modernizing urbanisms of a Haussmann or Le Corbusier, the quest for pure air, consistently belied by noir and polluted in Lynch's work, required the cleanup of the urban sewer and the banishment of the underground from modernity. It represented a victory of the rhetoric of the light and the air over the dark, tepid and dank. This tradition, of course, fuels the design imagination of genres like the Gothic and the film noir, and allows us to return directly to Lynchian infrastructure. The Enlightenment's designs on air, as Anthony Vidler has argued, would culminate in the modernist glass utopias of the early 20th century. Think of that sequence that I showed you, or the image from Tati's Playtime, and the dream of transparency in the glass architecture that Tati is ironizing and making jokes about as human bodies actually run into the glass. Vidler has argued that these designs on air would culminate in the modernist glass utopias of the early 20th century and their myths of communicative transparency. Now, this is Vidler. Transparency of the self to nature, of the self to the other, of all selves connected to society, and all this represented, if not constructed, by a universal transparency of building materials, spatial penetration, the ubiquitous flow of light, air, and physical movement. We seem like we're a long way from David Lynch at this point. I realize that. We're coming back. As Lynch knows, this airy rationalist myth was always haunted by a counter-Enlightenment tradition of visual opacity, of windows marred by dust and dirt, panes ruptured by the terror of political life, or uncannily darkened by non-knowledge and anxiety. In The Elephant Man, 1980, for example, the dream of transparency, of pure air as a social fantasy, of visualization, surveillance, control, is incarnated in the melodrama of John Merrick, circus freak turned medical curiosity turned proper Victorian gentleman. That is the story of The Elephant Man, in short. For Lynch, 19th century social life is primarily spectacular. Merrick's path of bourgeois humanization, his being turned from inhuman freak to an interiorized human seer, founders on the inevitability of spectacle, of always being subject to curious views of those who would open up his obscene inside. And in the film, this becomes quite literal in Merrick's, in the room that Merrick is living in the hospital, because every night the night porter opens up Merrick's room to visits. He brings drunk men and women in, and they spectacularize Merrick. They make a spectacle of Merrick in his living room. For those who don't know the film, I'll show you a sequence. In fact, Lynch stages Merrick's anguished declaration that he is not an animal, but a human being, amidst the obscene, sworn publicity of a near riot in a public toilet. The infrastructural terms of this spectacular culture are perhaps most evident when Merrick, seated at night at his window and building his model church, is interrupted by Sonny Jim, the night porter, tapping at his window outside. At night, the window pane's transparency thickens into a dense, textural surface. As in Eraserhead, this kind of irrational visual opacity is matched by another stunning montage of what I call in my book Lynchian bad plumbing. And I can say more about bad plumbing in the Q&A.
best you ask me for my services.
The sequence replays in more specifically 19th century terms what we could call the noir infrastructure of the violated interior. The montage bridges and deterritorializes disturbed insides, beginning with Merrick's nightmare, but ending with the fitful sleep of Merrick's chief benefactor, Dr. Treves. The rational doctor is awakened to the fact of his own irrational kinship with Mr. Bites. Mr. Bites leads the carnival spectacle in which we find the Elephant Man at the beginning of the film. Like Merrick, faced with the mirror, Treves is disturbed by a surprising foreignness in himself. This nightmare of uncanny dispossession, shared by Merrick and Treves, is also the story of industrial modernity's own haunting by the very kinds of monsters that have always frustrated its taxonomies and schemes of order. Hybrids of nature and culture, animal and machine, human and inhuman. And those hybrids are being produced in Lynch's infrastructure here. Notice how the sound of wild elephants dissolves into the clanking of machines and shots of bare-torsoed men laboring over clanking wheels and levers throwing off steam. In an earlier scene in which Treves ministers to the victim of a grotesque industrial accident, Lynch has shown how modern machinery produces its own monstrous calamities of the flesh. Like mad elephants, machines, the doctors say, are indomitable things. You can't reason with them. Here and elsewhere, Lynchian infrastructure betrays its fascination with what architectural historian David Gisson has recently called subnatures, those suspect forms of nature that modern architecture has repressed in its utopian tendency to welcome into its design schemes happier, more desirable forms of environment: sun, clouds, tree, wind. The domain of the subnatural is what Lynch is always welcoming into his interiors. Natural forms deemed primitive, dank in darkness, filthy, dust, smoke, exhaust, fearsome, gas or debris, uncontrollable, weeds, insects, pigeons. Subnatures are for Gisson peripheral forms of nature envisioned as threatening to inhabitants or to the material formations and ideas that constitute modern architecture. Lynch's infrastructural imagination everywhere acknowledges the way in modernity built and natural environments co-evolve. They produce atmospheric hybridity, various kinds of bad weather. Gisson helps us to pursue a more materialist approach to the quirks of Lynchian infrastructure. For Lynch's subnatural atmospheres, their impure air, their strange circuits, their tendencies to obstruct seemingly more natural circulations, flows, and transmissions, and insert the home into more unstable environments are also, I'd like to suggest, ways of thinking about infrastructure's relationship to power, and indeed to media itself. Eraserhead, famously, ends with another power failure, which begins catastrophically, but ends in comedy. This all happens when Henry Spencer, the protagonist of the film, kills his infant. Henry's act of infanticide, a violent opening of a mysterious inside, precipitates the film's final transfers of energy across interiors, of bodies and walls, proximate furniture and distant planets, light bulbs and radiators. The electric din in Henry's room intensifies in proportion to the baby's foaming guts. Sparks shoot from inside an electrical socket, causing Henry's lamp to flicker stroboscopically, blindingly, before burning out. The burnout cracks a hole in the planet first plumbed in the film's prologue, and opening Lynch's camera again, and we also saw this in the Elephant Man montage, follows inside to find the man and the planet, his levers kicking off their own sparks, desperately trying to maintain control of his machine before all is lost in the final white-hot union of Henry and the woman in the radiator, the film's incarnation of the wish for stable infrastructure. When asked about the main influence of Eraserhead's anxious interior design, Lynch's standard reply is Philadelphia. Living with his wife and daughter in an impoverished South Philly neighborhood, Lynch has often described his urban life as the experience of a vulnerable interiority. There was racial tension and just violence and fear. I said to someone, all that separated me from the outside world was this brick wall, but that brick wall was like paper. Yet the film, I think, refuses to establish a conservative version of privacy against the depredations of inner life. As a series of insides and outsides are in the sequence magically traversed by air, electricity, and light, the dark room of Henry's apartment returns the window to its etymological roots: window, wind, and eye, a visual opening, an aperture for the passage of air and light. And yet both Henry and Lynch's viewer experience this opening not as a frame onto a painterly view, but as an exposure to the entrance of blinding stroboscopic light that disrupts the security of our controlled view, plunges us into intermittent darkness. In a way, you could say this entire sequence is an opaque window. What's more, this kind of violent overexposure happens in a dark room that is explicitly photographic. In other words, Eraserhead offers us Lynch's first fully mediated living room. This domestic interior, like Henry's own, is displaced from itself, its artificial light linked up to a strange circuitry of rhythms, currents, and forces that keeps home life always uncanny. If the home, as Lynch is fond of saying, is, quote, the place where things can go wrong, always tending towards noir, then one of the less remarked features of Lynch's work is its tendency to imagine domestic insecurity via compromised and thus newly visible infrastructure. This is, of course, where a noir sensibility reveals its abiding generic connections to melodrama, while linking domestic distress to the systems of industrial and post-industrial modernity that condition it. As Henri Lefebvre once observed, every apparently solid house is, quote, permeated from every direction by streams of energy which run in and out of it by every imaginable route: water, gas, electricity, telephone lines, radio and television signals. And even though home dwellers tend not to picture their happy domestic lives as infrastructural nodes, they should, I think, watch more David Lynch movies, because Lynch is, especially in his overtly noir riffs, always opening the secure interior to energetic systems that traverse it and displace it from itself. In Blue Velvet's famed opening sequence, for example, Lumberton's too good to be true, happy infrastructure, right? This wonderful fire engine quickly malfunctions in the quotidian drama of Mr. Beaumont's blocked garden hose, whose kinking, its interrupted circulation, is somehow linked to his abrupt heart attack, and which takes us in Lynch's camera quickly down into the domain of insectoid subnature we might say is this film's answer to Reagan's Sunny Morning in America. In Lost Highway, of course, the fractures in Fred and Renee Madison's marriage are exacerbated by the mysterious arrival of increasingly invasive videotapes of their home from an unknown observer, despoiling the couple's already strained private life, underscoring how Fred's fragile modern psyche and his vulnerable modern home are alike contaminated, displaced by uncanny media. Mulholland Drive, remember, begins and ends in the Hollywood Hills with the disruption of traffic, LA's famed circulatory apparatus, in the traumatic car accident that brings an amnesiac Rita to her dream lover Diane. just the first in a series of infrastructural networks that Betty, as Diane, will re-engineer or fantasize out of thin air to stanch the pain of a lost love object. In moments like this, Lynch reminds us, I think, that the golden age of film noir transpires alongside the expanding technological infrastructures of the post-war period, the explosion of unseen communication networks, whose etherealization is one of the hallmarks of the information society. Noir anxiety is not just then the signature affect of masculine crisis, but is shaped by the historical heyday of what Susan Sontag, referencing Marshall McLuhan, called the rise of the infrasensible. Quote, an unprecedented change in what rules our environment from the intelligible and visible to what is only with difficulty intelligible and invisible. Noir is anxious, we might say, about modernity's production of air, that imponderable ur-substance of the modern into which, paraphrasing Marx, all solid things melt. At the mid-century period of noir's emergence, this air had become decidedly heavy, its turbulent atmospheres newly infiltrated by a burgeoning military-industrial complex, the baffling times and speeds of a nascent information society, and the latent atmospheric fallout of an atomic culture of abundance. Lynch knows this and insists on the materiality, the sheer weight of air. On a methodological level, recent critical attention to infrastructure, by returning us to blocked pipes and bad plumbing, risky roads and deadly bridges, glitchy electrical grids and communication networks, promises a reflexive, materialist approach to aesthetics that finds something to love about infrastructure's remediation in literature and film. In her new book, a great new book, titled Corridor, Media Architectures in American Fiction, Kate Marshall argues that the most banal circulation technologies of modern life, plumbing systems, air vents, highways, function as material symbols, describing and producing social life, and also as self-aware medial objects. The topography of infrastructure for Marshall reveals the complex communicative relays systematically connecting persons and places that would otherwise remain unconnected. Inherently metaphoric, then, infrastructure for Marshall always refers both to physical structures and to the collectivities joined by them. By understanding communication itself in its broadest McLuhanite sense as a transit system for persons, things, and messages, Marshall's methodology offers a provocative way of reading the entanglements of physical and abstract or informational infrastructures within narratives in which, say, sewers metaphorize flows of information, or holes or corridors trope the condition of media interfaces themselves. Those mysterious zones of interaction, in Alex Galloway's terms, that mediate between different realities, from windows and screens to channels, sockets, and holes. When the material infrastructure of the built environment appears in its most explicit form as the architecture of communication in a film, the film, we might say, communicates itself. It's talking about its own medial processes. This is film's way of thematizing its own participation in the communication systems of modern social life. These communications force themselves into visibility when they're blocked, when their transmissions fail, when they reveal the foundational noise in every communicative act. And this approach is especially helpful for considering Lynch's work and aesthetic program, which has proven so hard to materialize for critics because of the way its infrastructure seems simply impossible. Everything, it seems, is part of the same grid. Electricity flows and fails to flow in strange currents that suggest an infinitely renewable energy source, or produces all matters of uncanny revivification, life after death. In my book on Lynch, I argue that the director's sustained attention to communicative failures, the atmospheres of bad air evident in the noisy transmissions of Sailor and Lula's radio and Wild at Heart, the failure of lyric materiality that Lynch joins to the operations of cinema itself in Mulholland Drive's astonishing Club Silencio scene. These are moments when Lynch, in refusing his character's desire to communicate as airy vessels, actually insists on the mortality and vulnerability of the body, the trauma of contingency that humans share with inhuman media. All right, so now we're going to talk about Inland Empire, and then I'm going to be done, I promise. So a coda on Inland Empire. As a coda, I'd like to extend some of my comments on noir infrastructure to the particular challenge of David Lynch's most recent feature. And it's been a while, it's worth admitting, 2006. An impossible 3-hour film that nobody understands, least of all me. I'm particularly interested in the way the airy, specifically informatic and electrical infrastructure of this, Lynch's first digital film, continues, but now in our contemporary media culture, a series of noir tendencies I've described today. First, noir's way of linking infrastructure to what is imperiled or vulnerable in lived experience as the systems that condition life dematerialize. This is what I've been describing as noir's anxiety or paranoia in the face of air. And second, noir's way of binding the limits of what is common and shared in public life to infrastructure. This is noir's, we might say, sentimental utopianism for forms of collective life. At the same time, Inland Empire works as a really nice example of how Lynch uses noir's spatial imagination to convey reflexively the entanglement of physical and abstract infrastructure, what I've been discussing through Kate Marshall's work. In my book on Lynch, I explored his tendencies to understand media themselves as channels, conduits, or relays of organic dynamics and psychophysiological currents, always somehow networked. Conversely, Lynch understands the body as mediumistic. It finds its organs, to paraphrase Walter Benjamin, in various forms of technology. This is especially evident in Inland Empire's curiously collective circuits of power and violence, electricity, and shared world-making. When Inland Empire communicates itself as digital cinema, it communicates something about the electric life of the collective body at the heart of its surprising optimism. So I'm really interested in the way you could think about Lynch as maybe most social and most thoughtfully utopian about collective life in Inland Empire, which I realize may be perverse, but maybe appropriately so. More than any of his films, Inland Empire, as you know, for those of you who've seen it recently, beggars description. Its narrative descended from the start and later multiply derailed in an intoxicating hash of highly atmospheric situations. Inland Empire's plot, such as it is, concerns an actress named Nikki Grace, who's recently received a starring role in a contrived Hollywood melodrama called On High in Blue Tomorrows. In the course of rehearsing Tomorrows, Nikki and her co-star Devin Burke have an affair, which seems to precipitate the narrative's derailing. And it really just goes off the rails, as you know, into what I call an intoxicating hash of highly atmospheric situations of variously troubled women. Nikki's situations, we might say, are never properly hers, but somehow atmospheric. They appear as anticipations and echoes in the film's broader Lost Girls series. And that's what the film is doing. It's joining various forms of sites of Lost Girls from Lodz, Poland to Los Angeles. The Lost Girls series extends from Nikki to her alter ego Susan to the leggy posse of teenage girls who dance the locomotion in some alternative domestic universe to the hookers on Hollywood Boulevard to the film's inaugural wayward woman, the young prostitute who begins the film proper. In the film's conclusion, Nikki saves another lost girl by killing a mystery man known as the Phantom and uniting the girl with her husband and son. This plot summary, as you know, does absolutely no justice to this 3-hour assault on the senses that is Inland Empire, but I felt worth reminding you guys of what narrative there is. The film's opening sequence proclaims its medial self-awareness. A beam of projected light illuminates the film's title, and the close-up grooves of a scratchy phonograph stylus announce Axon N, the longest-running radio play in history, continuing tonight in the Baltic region, a gray winter day in an old hotel. We now witness, presumably, a first local performance of this longest-running story, an anonymous, anxious encounter between prostitute and John in an unrecognizable hotel room. After the scene, the so-called lost girl, an incarnation or iteration of the prostitute we've just seen, makes her way towards her eventual intimacy with the film's protagonist, Nikki Grace, which will consist in their, on some level, becoming media for and to each other. This is the reunion at the end of the film. For now, she weeps the lost girl in front of a television set that moves in and out of static like so many of Lynch's nested screens, projects future scenes of Inland Empire itself, and somehow opens onto the set of Rabbits. an 8-part web series first distributed on davidlynch.com. The film's media ecology, projection, phonography, the performing body, radio, TV, the internet, is wildly impure, upping the ante on McLuhan's axiom that media always take as their content another medium, embedding its characters in a vast digital network of fractal worlds that open onto each other through electricity. Electricity, Inland Empire suggests, is the uncanny agent of the infinitely flexible life shared by digital media and consciousness itself. As Jeffrey Sconce has shown, the metaphysics of electricity has, over the last 150 years or so, operated by a durable series of interrelated metaphors of flow, and Lynch is always using these metaphors, suggesting analogies between electricity, consciousness, and information that enable fantastic forms of electronic transmutation, substitution, and exchange. In Lynch's case, these homologies have appeared most forcefully in his increasingly public arguments for the compatibility of his theory of embodied consciousness, which he metaphorizes when he's interviewed as a light bulb or an ocean of pure, vibrant consciousness where creativity really flows, and a particular proposition of theoretical physics called unified field theory, a notion that for Lynch and others is compatible with the Vedic practice of transcendental meditation. So when you hear of Lynch today, you might have read recently in the New York Times Magazine, he's always stumping for transcendental meditation. He's not making any movies. Yet Inland Empire avoids, I think, recuperating electric life as a model of romantic transcendence or spiritual unity, chiefly through its materialist exploration of digital infrastructure and its insistence that the flows of electronic media, information, and consciousness share a basic situational instability. Everything we might say is atmosphere, and this, Lynch seems to think, just is life. No surprise then that many critics have explained the nonlinear, recursive temporality of Inland Empire as a kind of performance or enactment of the experiential qualities of a global digital environment. The untimely speed of a series of openings or interfaces to other virtual sites, the feeling of sudden, often violent connectivity with heretofore unknown spacetimes, the sense of algorithmic, non-deterministic causation. For some film and media theorists, of course, this infrastructure has transformed the experience of cinema itself, changes taken up directly in the film. Lynch's insertion of rabbits into the network of Inland Empire is not only an insistence of what we call today media convergence, but a knowing commentary on the digital transformation of the cinematic itself, which has now become a multimedia event, one that depends both on complex forms of storytelling, puzzle films, game films, modular narratives, database narratives, etc., but also putatively more interactive or participatory forms of cross-platform spectatorship. 2 paragraphs. The unformed situation is the intermittent heart of Inland Empire's noir infrastructure, but it's also at the center of the film's understanding of power and the social more broadly. Physical and abstract infrastructure mutually code each other. Inland Empire's dazzling architecture of experience, its profusion of thresholds, open doors, that's basically what the film is at the end of the day. This concatenation of situations and their architectural sites. Thresholds, open doors, stairways, alleys, streets, and halls through which Nikki Grace passes partakes of the worldliness not just of the digital interface, but also the vulnerable female body in time. In fact, I think the film asks us to experience the anxiety and dread, the precariousness and terror of an unformed situation, the subjection to aggressive male power and violence that in Inland Empire one senses is simply systemic, networked, invisible. We are, on some level, back in Henry Spencer's elevator, where we started. Except that the invisible glitches in Inland Empire's infrastructure always return us to another location of a specifically female vulnerability, distress, and disempowerment. By linking the depredations of male power and violence to the categorical instability of private life, and indeed a systemic infrastructural malaise that joins LA somehow to its elsewhere and loads Poland, Inland Empire recalls the Ur work of infrastructural noir, Chinatown, whose infamous director, recall, was trained at Lode's prestigious National Film School. In Chinatown, the obscenity of Noah Cross's abuse of power is marked in his incestuous relationship with his daughter, Evelyn Mulray, whose victimization is doubled on a civic level in Cross's scheme to capitalize on infrastructure by diverting water away from farmers in the San Fernando Valley and towards LA's expanding horizon of development in the arid desert. Screenwriter Robert Towne's fascination with the hydraulic history of LA allows the city to play in Chinatown what Mike Davis calls its double role as utopia and dystopia for advanced capitalism. By relocating the water wars of the 1910s to the 1930s of Dashiell Hammond and Raymond Chandler, Towne underscores the violence of capitalism itself within a climate of New Deal liberalism in which infrastructure incarnated a dream of what is possible in collective life. Infrastructure incarnates a dream of what is possible in collective life. Is it too much to suggest that Lynch, in this endlessly reflexive, knowing film, is signaling a relationship between Nikki Grace's contemporary Los Angeles, filled with homeless girls, and a noir vision of the city's infrastructural history by one of Lotes Film School's most celebrated graduates? Like the title Inland Empire, Chinatown names less a specific location than a condition of epistemological insecurity and non-knowledge, the kind of anxiety produced around just such buried connections and absconded systems. Unlike Polanski's film, though, Inland Empire ends on a utopian note. It connects impossibly the film's separated lost girls, returning them to happy homes. It returns Nikki Grace to her now peaceful living room. It populates it with the various incarnations of Inland Empire's stories, as well as actors and design elements that Lynch had assembled from previous films, media forms, and performances. In bringing into happy community the denizens of assorted interiors from any number of scattered locations in the Lynchian universe, it insists, Inland Empire does, on media infrastructure as a means of assembling the social. The scene, like Chinatown, reminds us that Noir's failed dreams of infrastructural security began in similar fantasies of the common. Thanks.